Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, which is the land on which I'm meeting in Canberra tonight, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to note that Indigenous Australians experience a disproportionate level of gambling-related harm, and the weekend's referendum result was disappointing, I think, for those of us working to reduce harm in Indigenous communities. I'd like to acknowledge the guest speakers and all of the attendees tonight. We're joined by the Honourable Kate Chaney. She's the independent member for Curtin, the member of the House of Representatives Committee on Social Policy and Legal Affairs, who held the inquiry into online gambling and its impact on those experiencing gambling harm. David Pocock, he's an independent senator for Canberra, and he has advocated quite strongly for reducing harmful marketing and promotion and restoring integrity to politics. The Reverend Tim Costello, who's the Alliance's chief advocate. John, who is going to join us to talk about his own experience of gambling harm. And I want to acknowledge that we are joined tonight by some state and federal MPs, their staff, some local councillors, council officers, especially our leadership councils, some donors, those with lived experience of gambling harm, and of course, all of our supporters. So terrific to have everyone involved in this important event for Gambling Harm Awareness Week. So I just wanted to kick off by outlining just a few of the highlights that we're seeing at the moment in what is a watershed moment for gambling reform. The last 12 months have seen some significant progress towards gambling reform. And just to give you a very short snapshot of that, Tasmania announced mandatory pre-commitment on all EGMs, which should be in place by November next year. It's the first state to do so, and it's terrific to see. We've seen the federal inquiry into online gambling and its impacts on those experiencing harm. The Alliance has made multiple submissions to that inquiry. We've provided evidence. We've supported people who have lived experience to provide testimony. The report was released in June, as most of you are probably aware, and we're awaiting the government's response to that report, which we're expecting by December this year. The report is clear. Australians are experiencing significant gambling harm, and the 31 recommendations provide a roadmap to address that harm, including to treat it as a public health concern, to introduce a national gambling regulator, and to bring in a comprehensive ban on gambling ads. Victoria's announced major reforms. The mandatory pre-commitment card is one of the ones that they're hoping to introduce. They're looking at reduced opening hours, reduced spin rates of poker machines, and continued casino reforms. We saw gambling reform become a major election issue in New South Wales. There's still a lot to do in New South Wales. It's the gambling capital, but community support we know is strong. The Northern Territory lowered the cap on the number of poker machines in the territory following a major community campaign against a proposal for new poker machine licences in 2 hotels. But the community are still fighting against the addition of another 10 machines in 2 other hotels, but still some progress there. And the federal government has announced some significant reforms in the form of a ban on gambling online with credit cards, and the legislation we expect might be introduced to Parliament this week. We've seen improved messaging taglines for gambling ads. We've seen BetStop, the National Self-Exclusion Register, finally launched in August, so there are some developments there. But of course, we've seen poker machine losses last week. We released some information about what's been happening pre and post-COVID, and we saw a $14.5 billion increase in losses in 5 states. So that's a 13.7% increase on pre-COVID figures from 2018-19. Significant losses, particularly in New South Wales, Queensland and South Australia. So we still continue to work with state governments and state ministers to try and address this issue, but a lot more needs to be done. And Tim and I were really pleased to recently be invited to meet with the Prime Minister, and we continue to meet with politicians on all sides of the political spectrum. We've particularly enjoyed a really good relationship with the federal crossbench, who've made integrity and tackling harmful product marketing and promotion a really strong feature of their work. So we'll have the opportunity to hear from our crossbenchers tonight, from two of them. But I'd like to kick off this forum by asking our Chief Advocate, Tim Costello, the Reverend Tim Costello, who needs no introduction, to share his thoughts on what this moment for gambling reform has meant. So welcome, Tim, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me okay.
Very well.
So really appreciate you investing your time. I actually believe that gambling is the #1 public health crisis in Australia. It's hidden because no governments have actually done the work to show the contribution to domestic violence, but we know it's way over 25% of domestic violence assaults. The contribution to mental health problems, we know it's a very significant contributor to mental health. Of course, the contribution to crime, only New South Wales and their crime commission actually had the courage to look into that and found billions of dollars of dirty money. And the former New South Wales Gaming Minister, Victor Dominello, who approved that crime commission report, said it explains why New South Wales never cracked with their inquiry the ice epidemic, because they never cracked the business model. And the business model was so many traffickers were cleaning up the ice they were selling across New South Wales by laundering it through pokies. So what we now know is that this public health crisis has actually broken through public consciousness. If I think over 25 years ago, when I started raising my voice about gambling, I was sort of a lone voice. Even the Melbourne Age editorialised against me and said, "Go away, gambling's harmless, gambling's good fun." If you know the Melbourne Age, you would say, my goodness, even them. Well, what we've seen is a shift in public understanding that this is a crisis, a public health crisis. It's represented, as we know in the figures, that we have not only the greatest losses per head in the world, but 40% higher than the nation that comes second, largely due to pokies, but with sports betting 20% higher per capita losses than the nation that comes second. And why do we have so many, and they're important, gambling help services in Australia? Because we have the most gambling harm anywhere in the world. So to see the supply side of gambling help services start to flourish, multiply, but without reducing at all the demand side, where so many opportunities to gamble is essentially the place we're in at the moment. People are told, governments are doing all of this and funding these counselling services, but we now have a record of losses in New South Wales, $8 billion for the first time ever on pokies. A record in Victoria, over $3 billion in pokies. So here's the curious paradox. Right at the time this has broken through in public consciousness, when there's never been more concern in the community, we're still seeing record losses. We're seeing them go up. So in the theory of democratic politics, it sort of runs like this. If you change public opinion, then you will get political change, policy change. That's the theory, right? So how come we're still seeing record losses? Well, when it comes to pokies at state level, we are still, despite some green shoots in the concrete that Carol mentioned in Tasmania. The Liberal government in Tasmania that is to bring in that binding cashless card for pokies may fall. We know Labor is absolutely walking away in Tasmania from their bipartisan support. We know Labor have done a dirty deal with the Tasmanian Hospitality Association. We know that almost certainly if the Liberal government falls, that will go down. In Victoria, we've had some good announcements, really the last act of Dan Andrews. However, we have no timetable for them implementing what they said. In New South Wales, when it comes to pokies, it's been kicked off to a 2-year trial. Chris Minns tragically would not match Dominic Perrottet's cashless card promise. The reason? In New South Wales, 5 venues are run by the Labor Party. 5 pokies venues. $130 million in assets built up from losses of people. Millions each year that can fund Labor elections. The truth is, when it comes to Labor, there is no respectable party anywhere in the democratic world that funds elections from running gambling. None. Only Australian Labor. I'm one who has been campaigning for the Voice. I'm feeling very gutted that it's gone down. But I've said publicly in meetings, in my view, Labor has a gambling problem and the Conservatives have a race problem. Nothing has shifted my view on that. And when Carol and I met with the Minister, Michelle Rowlands, and the response to the magnificent report of Kate Chaney and the other bipartisan committee recommending a phased-in 3-year ban, I came out of that meeting not knowing, but feeling pretty low, feeling I was being managed, feeling that the CEOs of 7, 9, 10 and Murdoch really, with the AFL, with the NRL, were going to win the day again. I felt, and I hope I'm wrong, but that's what I felt. That's what my intuition was. Well, we've won public opinion, but the donations, vice-like grip of the gambling industry still on the major parties, I think has not shifted, which is why the work of David Pocock and Kate Chaney and the Teals and others is just so important. And can I say, the magnificent work of Peter Murphy. I think both sides, her side and certainly Dutton's side, were surprised at the clarity of her cross-examination, the fact that it was a bipartisan support with a Labor chair. That has, I think, surprised both Albo and Dutton. And we all know that Peter Murphy has struggled with health issues. For her to actually stand up, deliver that report with Kate, with the others there, and Keith Wallahan and Libs too, is this bipartisan moment, and we know the referendum on the Voice failed. No referendum ever gets up without bipartisanship. We know that. The predictable happened. But this was bipartisan on the 31 recommendations on introducing the ban. This could be a unifying moment for Australia. So my State of the Union helicopter view, Carol, is that we actually have won public opinion. Dads and mums have had a collective psychic vomit about their kids literally being groomed by all the ads coming out of foreign sports betting companies all registered in the Northern Territory, the back door, a tsunami of ads launched on the rest of Australia. It is a barbecue stopper if Albo or Dutton just says, right, we're implementing the bipartisan report. But the stopper at the moment, I still think, is the vice-like grip that the gambling industry has held politicians on both sides in thrall in this country for far too long, which is why we have this number one public health issue. Thanks, Carol. Back to you.
Thanks, Tim. And yeah, look, absolutely. And I think we do have this we have a once in a lifetime opportunity right now. I just noticed someone in the chat mentioned the Greens and Kate Furman in particular, and would like to acknowledge the Greens' contribution as well, because they have been very instrumental and very strongly supportive of gambling reform. So we should absolutely acknowledge that. And Tim and I have had a good relationship as well at the federal level with Senator Janet Rice and others in the Greens. So definitely wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you, Tim. Well, that was a call to action, and hopefully it's one that we're going to see heeded in the coming months. I just want to mention before we move to Kate that we actually have a question and answer session at the end of this presentation section. So there's a Q&A in the top of your toolbar, third from the left, and if you just if you put your questions in there, we'll make sure that we go through as many as we can tonight. So on that note, I'd like to introduce Kate Chaney. And Kate, we really look forward to hearing your views on what you think will come from the online gambling report, what surprised you in the inquiry, and any particular impacts that that inquiry had on you or impressions it left on you. So over to you. Thanks, Kate. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks very much, Carol. And thanks for having me here tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I have to say I sit on 3 committees and have done a number of inquiries on a few of those committees. And this has been my favourite one so far. Because there was really good multi-partisan support. And Tim, we use the word multi-partisan, not bipartisan now, but really great and really agreement on a lot of the issues. So it felt like a really constructive process, and actually it felt like it was the way we expect our parliamentary representatives to behave and investigate things and find common solutions together. So very positive experience. What I hope will come from the report, well, there are 31 recommendations in the report, and they are fairly far-reaching. So, of course, I hope that we see them all being implemented. And broadly, they cover things like having a national strategy on gambling, having a national approach to regulation and a national regulator, because we really did see what a Swiss cheese regulatory environment it is. It included public education campaigns funded by a levy on online gambling providers, more research, better data, tighter regulations for illegal or offshore gambling providers, better service delivery. A big one is the phasing out of all online gambling advertising. And it's confusing when you use the words. It's all advertising on all different media for online gambling, not just the online advertising part of gambling. As well as some other changes around classifications and consumer protections for simulated gambling. So that, and I could go on, a lot of great recommendations. Probably if I had one wish, it would be on the ad ban, or possibly the national strategy, depending on whether the national strategy actually then turns into a proper thing and not a piece of paper. But I think the ban for ads did have broad support from the committee, and certainly in my electorate, it has broad community support as well. And I've had a number of constituents come and tell me how much it drives them nuts when they are watching sport with their kids and there are just gambling ads all the time. So I think that is something that would have really broad support across the community, and I can't see the government being punished for that, other than by those with the money and the power. And this has really been the barrier to reform in this area in the past, is money and power. And it comes down to the TV stations who get money from the gambling companies, the sports codes who have various revenue streams, and that's really, and the gambling companies themselves. And certainly when I hear things like that Sportsbet made donations to the communications minister to the tune of about $19,000 in the week before the election, I think that's something we really have to make it clear that this is not acceptable. And I could digress off into political donation reform that I'm also working on. There isn't a recommendation in this report banning donations from gambling companies, but I think that would be a very good addition to it. My understanding, so lots of great recommendations. Certainly being on the committee, hearing the voice of lived experience was very powerful. And I think it's all very well to have, either TV stations or gambling companies coming in and telling you all about how it's actually fine. But then when you hear the voice of people who have experienced problems with gambling and suffered some, harm from it, you realise how it is just not a fair fight. And I think especially with online gambling, you're pitching someone and their will against a company that has really sophisticated data about your weaknesses, really. And we heard that gambling companies are gathering up to 200 pieces of data about each individual customer. They then use that data, and they're using AI to use that data to identify what that person's gambling behaviour is. Now, they presented this as something that would be useful, that the industry could benefit from using it to identify problem gamblers. But I'm willing to bet, if you don't mind me using that phrase, that it's currently being used to maximise profits. And so it really breaks down this narrative of personal responsibility when you hear that voice of lived experience, and you understand that that the gambling companies know just when to get you and how to get you get you back on onto that gambling behaviour. So certainly the lived experience was very powerful. Now, so that report went in. I was really happy with where we got to on that, and there were no dissenting reports in that report, which is also unusual. So that was a very good sign that there's broad support for it. Now we are waiting, and we've been waiting for 4 months. And the government says it is consulting with stakeholders. Now, I know that it's had one meeting with Tim and Carol, but I suspect that there are a lot of meetings being had with TV stations, gambling companies, sporting codes, and really we're going to see, I hope quite soon, what impact those meetings have had and whether we see these recommendations watered down. We included in there a phasing out of gambling ads over a 4-year period, trying to take into account the impact on TV stations, or give sporting codes an opportunity to find different sponsors. But a lot of the complaints we hear from both media and sporting codes sound very similar to what we would have heard from tobacco all that time ago. And the sky did not fall in, and sporting codes found different sponsors and TV stations found different advertisers. So I'm hoping that government can actually look beyond the vested interests and the donors and make decisions on this legislation that are in the interest of community rather than those vested interests. I do acknowledge that because of one of the things that surprised me in the committee was the complexity of regulation around online gambling across the country, and it's state by state. There are lots of different bodies. It's really unclear who's in charge of what. And as a result of that, I suppose there is a consultation process to go through to understand what needs to happen at a state level in order to implement these recommendations. So there probably is some complexity in the implementation, but it would be nice to see government coming out shortly and responding to the very strong community support for meaningful reform in this area, and being gutsy about it, because I do think that it's probably it's a bit of a vote winner as well. So I'd like to see government responding to that and not chickening out. I probably will leave it there. I think I've covered the things I said I would cover. So thanks for listening to me.
Thanks so much, Kate. And we really appreciate all the work that you and the committee did, and Peter Murphy, of course, as chair. It was a brilliant report with 31 really strong, clear recommendations, and certainly has the community's support. So I hope you're right, and I hope that the messages are getting through, and that we will see a change, as we did with tobacco, and when the sky didn't fall in. But certainly, as you say, very much a David versus Goliath type battle that we are facing, but we're looking forward to the response to that report very soon. Thank you so much for joining us, Kate. We really appreciate your thoughts and honest comments. It was terrific to hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks.
So I'm going to introduce Senator David Pocock. David has been a strong champion for integrity in federal politics, and he's certainly supported banning promotion and marketing when it comes to harmful products, and has been quite a champion in this space to address gambling-related harm. So, David, if you are, I assume you're with us. Is David with us? Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, David. Lovely to have you with us, and really look forward to hearing your thoughts tonight. So I'll leave it to you. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Carol. And just want to start by thanking you and Tim for the leadership in this space over a long time now. Also like to thank Kate, Peter, and the committee for the great work that they did. Yet again, we've got an issue where the community is ahead of our politicians, and I'm not going to talk about the stats and just how bad it is. We know how bad it is. We're seeing it in our communities, and people want action. And I really think with this report, and I agree with Tim's take on it. I think Peter and the committee did a great job. It's a strong report. It's I think a great starting point for tackling this issue, and also recommending that we treat it as a health issue and not just an industry regulation issue, because this is clearly a health issue. I think one of the things that should be also looked at is the use of credit cards in online gambling. We need a strong response on all of the recommendations. And I guess from I never thought I'd get into politics, like many of the other independents on the crossbench, and it's been really eye-opening in seeing the way that things happen in there, and the level of access that certain industries and players have to the major parties. And so I think this is really one of those issues that we're probably not going to get the full suite of reforms that we desperately need without a range of other reforms around things like lobbying reform. The level of access to that building, I think, is a good thing, but it should be more transparent. We've got 2,000 people with access all areas passes that swipe in and swipe out of that building, and we've got no idea who they are. And the major parties don't want to hear about it. Today we had a vote in the Senate on a motion I moved to actually publicise those passes on Parliamentarians' Register of Interests, and it was the entire crossbench, the Greens, Jackie Lambie, One Nation, voting against the major parties. So there's a lot of work to do in this space. I think we're going to keep coming up against these vested interests and, frankly, corporations that have figured out the system. You make your political donations, and then you work the lobbying. You have jobs for mates. It's a revolving door. Not only seeing politicians retire and go into these industries, but at a staffer level, there's so many who, at the end of a government, then jump into lobbying for things like the gambling industry or the alcohol lobby groups. I also think we desperately need truth in political advertising laws. We've seen during the referendum some of the debate there and how there really are no guardrails for what politicians can say. I think another thing that would be really helpful is donation reform, and again, Kate Chaney's done some great work there. Actually, having a lower threshold, having better rules. The thing about Minister Rowland and those donations from a gambling company is that we only heard about them because the gambling company disclosed them. The minister was under no obligation because they fell under the threshold, and there's all these other workarounds when it comes to events. So I really do think this is going to take a big push on the major parties to get everything we need. The report's a great starting point. Again, we've been waiting 4 months now, and we're eagerly awaiting their response. And I think this is one of those issues where you have the crossbench, including the Greens, who've been at this for a long time now, united on wanting to get good outcomes for our communities and our country. To be the biggest losers in the world is not something any of us should be proud of, and it's not something any of us should stand for. We need to push the major parties on this. And yes, there's some serious vested interest, even here in the ACT with Labor's ownership of pokies. You're coming up against that all the time. So I'll leave it there. But thank you again for all the great work that you're doing. And yeah, I'm not sure how the question Q&A is going to work, but happy to answer any.
Well, actually, David, I was wondering if you and Kate might be prepared to take a couple of quick questions now, if you're available to stick around for a little while. We've had quite a few questions coming in on the chat. And given that you've just sort of alluded to this, David, somebody's asked about the Labor members of Parliament and whether or not you think they fully understand or comprehend the cost of gambling to the people that vote them in. Is that a question you're prepared to take?
I'm happy to take it. I mean, the thing that I've seen is that there's so many good people in here who see issues, they understand them, and then they are totally constrained by their party's position on things. And I think that's what we're coming up against. It's incredibly inconvenient to tackle something that you get a lot of donations from. You've got threats of negative campaigns against you. Your staff are getting good jobs. You potentially may have a sweet deal at some point. And there's so many of these industries that I think create this environment where we're not seeing these big issues being tackled. And again, the community is so far ahead of politicians when it comes to gambling, advertising, when it comes to climate action. And so, yeah, it's a really tough issue to tackle.
I might just add to that, Carol. I've had conversations with a number of Labor members who have said, yeah, I really want to see something done on it. And then when I've asked them to say something publicly or commit to something publicly, they've said, oh, I don't know if I can because, the relationship with the party and I probably can't speak out on it. So I think there probably is a bit of a mismatch between the party's position the people who vote in the party in terms of appetite for change. And I guess that's one of the complexities of being a legacy party, is you have to deal with, you know, the decisions that you've made in the past about where you get your money from. And certainly if the Labor Party currently gets revenue from 5 clubs that are full of pokies, that's a pretty big challenge, and one that I think should be called out. And really, I think, you know, that's going to be very difficult to address. I probably haven't pushed that so much because I'm really keen to see the recommendations in the report be implemented, but it does complicate the space, and it does, I think, as David's talked about, really illustrate the need for, you know, some broader reforms around our democracy as well.
Absolutely. And I know Tim has raised this issue quite a few times in the public domain. Tim, did you just want to add anything to that before we move on to the next question?
Sure. I just endorse what both have said. You know, it's fascinating to me that when you talk to the Labor backbench to reinforce what you said, Kate, they go, it's horrible. Our communities are against this. We would love to support the recommendations of your committee, the multi-partisan committee. And then I say, so will you say something? Exactly the response you just said, Kate. And you start to say, so I'd always sort of known, but never existentially known, that your pre-selection, your hope of ministerial advancement is totally tied up with looking away, silencing your own conscience, even when it's something your community wants and you personally have convictions about. It is quite extraordinary to be in that moment and go, oh my God, that's what's going on. So yeah, I mean, that's why I'm glad both you and David are there, breaking up that system, speaking freely. What a tonic, an absolute tonic that you're there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, here. Thanks, Tim. I might just take one more question before we move on, because I think people are quite keen to also hear from John. So Reverend Tim Costello identified gambling as the #1 public health issue in Australia today. Smoking was once seen as the #1 public health issue, but has been largely addressed by comprehensive public health strategies backed by political will. Can we hope for the same comprehensive action on gambling, and what can we learn from the public health campaigns on tobacco control? So, David, would you like to kick off on that one?
Sure, I'll leave some of that to Kate, because I think this is one thing that they've been looking at is that phased-in approach, and how do you deal with sports that are sort of entrenched with a certain industry and are reliant on them to some extent. I think the sort of other part of that, and why this is so hard, is that you've got industries that have learnt from what happened to tobacco and are at every turn trying to avoid that. And we're living in a different time now with the media and social media and the way that they are advertising and getting around regulations. But I think at the end of the day, you've just got to have parties with the political courage to just do it and to take on these industries. And as Kate said, I don't think this is a vote loser. Like I don't see anyone who's going to look at a major party who goes tough on gambling advertising and think, oh, I'm not gonna vote for them. So yeah, I would say we just need the courage from them to step up and say, okay, well, we're gonna do this. We're gonna put people ahead of profits for gambling companies.
I would just add that I think it's really useful having the example of tobacco, because it makes it very easy for people to see, oh yeah, things can change, and community attitudes completely change to, no, we can't do that, who's going to sponsor our sporting teams, to, oh, we did it and now we just all take it for granted. So as a model, even though David's right, no doubt the other side, learned some lessons from it too. It has been useful. What we've heard from the broadcasters is it's a very different time now to 30 years ago. Broadcasting is struggling, there won't be the sponsors. But I think that really government just has to be brave on it and act in the interest of the community rather than the donors. And the phase out, now we proposed a 4-year phase out with some specific stages, keeping in mind who might be most impacted in terms of sponsorship dollars and how it takes a few years to replace some sponsorship dollars. But I think with a reasonable path like that, there's no reason that it shouldn't be phased out, and government just has to toughen up and do it.
Well, let's hope they do. Look, I wonder if I could just ask you both just one very quick question in relation to this week's legislation before Parliament on the credit bill. There's a carve out for lotteries and for Keno, which we know can be quite harmful. And I know people tend to think lotteries are not harmful, but we know otherwise. And certainly the research suggests young men in particular, but growing proportion of young women as well as other members of the community are harmed. What are your thoughts on that, and what are the opportunities for having those issues addressed, given that there's a review?
The inquiry focused on online gambling, so that has really been the focus of where I've learnt more. I mean, I would say that that there should be, that I think these sorts of things would be included in a broad national gambling strategy. My understanding is that it is lower risk because it's less of that immediate dopamine impact. So I could understand there being some different approaches to regulating, lotteries. But if we implement the recommendations and actually take a national approach, I think it would allow appropriate decisions to be made, so we're not pushing a problem from one area to another.
Yeah, good point. I'd like to see that. David, do you want to make a comment on that?
I don't see why in a cost of living crisis, we should be saying to people that they can use credit cards to gamble. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So yeah, we'll be looking at the legislation. There's a whole heap of other stuff in the Senate at the moment, but we'll definitely have a look.
Thank you.
I do just want to point out that it's great that this bill's coming in, but it is worth noting that this is the easy bit, because the major wagering companies don't oppose this ban. So they're not, I sort of think we've got to not give government too much credit for doing this. This is definitely the easy, low-hanging fruit of reform, and we need to go a whole lot further than this.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you so much, both of you. We really do appreciate your time and your insights tonight. I encourage you to please use the QR code. There it is up there in the email to contact your federal MP and urge them to support the implementation of all of those recommendations from the online inquiry. So that's up there on the screen. And please do stay involved and do keep contributing your voices, because it does make a huge difference. And we know that the community is on side on this issue. We now just need to bring it home. So that concludes our forum tonight. Let's hope this is the year we can bring these reforms home and make Australia a better place. So thank you, everybody, for being here, and look forward to seeing you again. Thanks.